Well, we've got an update on a couple of Ducks prospects that we've got to talk about. All that and more on this edition of Locked On Anaheim Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network.
You're Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Anaheim Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Let's go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Locked On Anaheim Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jason Hernandez. I've been covering hockey for over a decade and also the PA voice for the Coachella Valley Firebirds. Yeah. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There is something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. It is the dog days of summer, but it is not the dog days of summer here because we've actually got something to talk about as far as talking about the prospects. And this has to do with the World Junior Showcase. So I mentioned this last week. What exactly is that? If you missed it, Robin Leonio and myself talked about the showcase that's happening this week in Plymouth, Michigan. And these are players that are trying out to be on the World Junior team next season. And this is several countries doing this. Finland's in there, Sweden's in there, Canada's in there, and of course, USA is in there, USA being the host country. But we're going to talk about a couple of the Americans because we haven't heard from the others quite yet. We haven't heard about any of the Europeans yet. Canada, they're still to come. But for now, we've got to talk about a couple of the draft picks. And the main draft pick that we are going to talk about is not from this year. It is from last year. And last year, the Ducks' late second round pick, in my opinion, he is starting to see his stock rise little by little. And let me just explain this really quickly. Last season, the Ducks' late second round pick with I want to say it was the 59th pick, was Carey Terrance. Now, Carey Terrance came from the Erie Otters. And I'll admit that I didn't cover the draft as much last season, mainly because I was dealing with an accident. But Carey Terrance, for what it's worth, was already a player whose stock was on the rise last season. And especially someone that is considered by some folks a little bit undersized. He's only 6'1", about $170 when he got drafted. He's put on some weight. I would say he looks more like 6'1", 6'2", about 185 to 1. Like, he's starting to gain weight. He's starting to gain muscle. That's something that we need to talk about. But when he was drafted, there was some saying he might end up being a third round pick. That was what was thought in last year's draft. This year, what I'm going to say is his stock has risen ever since the latter part of last season. Last year during juniors, Carey Terrance really came onto his own with the Lake Erie Monsters. He started to average a point a game. The year before that, he was averaging about half a point a game. Last season, 52 points in 56 games. So his stock was beginning to rise a little bit. He was also in the under-18s World Juniors last year, scoring 6 points in 7 games. This year, with the Otters making the playoffs, he looked pretty solid in those playoffs. Then we get to development camp, and specifically rookie development camp that took place at Great Park earlier this month. And Carey Terrance was one of the players that I personally was, I was more impressed with Carey Terrance compared to what I had seen last year during rookie camp, during development camp. And one big takeaway was that Carey Terrance was put on that line with Carter Gauthier. And those two had a terrific thing going together, a lot of give and goes. Terrance's speed is definitely a little bit better this year than it was last year. So that's a big thing. That begins with development camp. Then we get into the showcase this year, earlier this week, and Carey Terrance is one of those guys that is starting to get a lot of playing time. So for those who don't know about Carey Terrance, 19 years old, born May 10th, 05. He is from the Akwesasne Mohawk tribe from upstate New York. And Akwesasne is right on the border of Canada. In fact, it is a part of 2 provinces and 1 state. Part of Akwesasne is in Ontario, part of it is in Quebec, and the rest is in New York State. And he's part of the Mohawk tribe that is in the United States. So he's a U.S. citizen, part of that Mohawk tribe. And he's the first one from that tribe to get drafted in the National Hockey League. So that's a big deal for the tribe, big deal for his family, big deal for everyone in his indigenous community. So this is big. And for him to actually get a lot of playing time in the World Junior Showcase, that to me is a pretty big deal. So I'm going to give some props here. In the first game, he was up in the top line with Quentin Musty and Beckett Hendrickson. Musty from the San Jose Sharks, Hendrickson from the Boston Bruins. He was also seen on that power play unit with Hendrickson, with who else was he with? He was with LJ Mooney, who is 25 draft eligible. Also there is someone else that I kind of like thought he looks pretty solid. And I want to get this right, Jason Shagabe from the Tampa Bay Lightning. That power play unit looked pretty solid, got some pretty decent shots off, and this is trying to look at as much tape as possible from that showcase and from what I've seen online. Carey Terrance, I think, is one of those guys that's going to impress people down the line. One thing that he's improved on is his strength has gotten better. His skating has gotten better little by little. So the speed was decent enough when he was drafted, and it's improved. It looked good in the rookie development camp earlier this month. It's looking even better now during the showcase. But now he's adding on a physical aspect to his game. He's put on some weight. He's being more aggressive. Even though he is on that top line, I could see him being a solid depth piece in the WJCs this coming December for Team USA. So speed, big factor. Strength becoming more of a factor. On his second game with Team White, he was down on the second line with Quentin Musty from the Sharks and James Reeder, a prospect from the Los Angeles Kings. And that line still looked probably better than the top line, except for Cole Eiserman from the Islanders. But overall, his strength is getting better and better game by game. So this is someone that I think when the Ducks drafted him, they were hoping that he might be a depth piece, bottom 6 for the goals. But honestly, I could see him cracking the NHL roster. I would say his ceiling as of right now is bottom 6 in the National Hockey League. He's beginning to show some strength. He's beginning to show that there's something there when developed correctly. And we'll talk about that more in the second segment. I could see him becoming either a bottom 6 for the Ducks, assuming that some trades happen. The only thing, he is primarily a center. So it's going to be extremely tough for him to crack the Ducks roster, which is also why I say if he remains in the Ducks roster, the ceiling is bottom 6, because the Ducks already have a slew of guys up the middle. So it's looking like he could be a big piece for the San Diego Gulls down the line, but we'll see how that goes. But first step, get to World Juniors, maybe play another year in juniors and see where that goes. All right, we're going to head into the first intermission, and we'll talk a little bit more about developing these young Ducks. There's another player in the showcase that I'm going to talk about very briefly, hasn't gotten much playing time, but I do want to talk about this player's development more so. Stay locked in. And now a word from FanDuel. That is right. FanDuel is, well, first off, it is the dog days of summer, so there's not as much sports going on. But you know what? FanDuel lets me keep the sports going, especially baseball, whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball and the official sports betting partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. And please, folks, please gamble responsibly. Welcome back to Locked On Anaheim Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Once again, you're locked in with Jason Hernandez. Now let's talk about the development and how the Ducks are developing these young guys and how they've done it. Actually, I'm going to talk about how they should develop and what they've done the last couple of seasons because they do go hand in hand. So I'm going to start with the player that I just mentioned. I've been mentioning guys like Steven Solberg in the past, but I haven't really talked a whole lot about Carey Terrance yet. So Terrance did play in Erie last season, looked very good. He is still 19. He just turned 19. So he does have another year eligible in juniors. And if I were him, I might take that extra year in juniors. That's what the Ducks have done in the recent past, and it has paid off. Look at Mason McTavish. Look at Olin Zellweger. Look at insert player here. And a lot of those Ducks players that got to play an extra year in juniors, it has helped them in the long run in their development. And those two that I just mentioned, I think those are two of the cornerstone pieces for the Ducks' future. Mason McTavish, some folks are talking about him being a future captain. Olin Zellweger, he could be a cornerstone defenseman for the Ducks for years to come. And Carey Terrance's stock has risen to the point that I do think eventually he could maybe crack the Ducks roster. Maybe. But there's another player that is going to need a little bit more development. And this player I'm going to talk about right now, who just got drafted by the Ducks, and that is Austin Bernovic. Now, this was a pretty late pick for the Ducks this season. Austin Bernovic, he was someone that I actually didn't think the Ducks were going to take, but lo and behold, he was selected pretty late, might I add. 6th round, really a fascinating player. He's got high hockey IQ. He tries to think of a play maybe 4 or 5 steps ahead. Great puck handler, has to work on his skating. That's a big thing. Also needs to work a little bit on skating's the big thing, actually. That's the main thing that he has to work on. The short bursts of speed are good. However, turning puck over is a bit of an issue, which has to do a little bit with his speed and going back on defense. That is also a slight bit of a concern, but he is very much a solid power winger that could be in the Ducks or really the Gulls' future. Bernovic only played 1 game and didn't get a whole lot of playing time. So I think it's going to be important for him to get some more playing time, a lot of playing time coming up. He is expected to play at St. Cloud State this coming year. That's where he is set to play this coming year in the NCAA. This will be his first year in the NCAA. Last season, he was with the Madison Capitals of the USHL, and he could play a couple seasons at St. Cloud State before eventually being probably a piece for the San Diego Gulls. But, I mean, he's got something there. He's got some good power forward skills. Could he wind up being a good piece with development for the Ducks? Yeah, absolutely. But that is something that the Ducks have been pretty decent on for the most part. And this is me being honest. For the most part, the Ducks have done a decent job developing players. Olin Zellweger is one player that I think has been developed well, except for maybe 1 year. And that's it. And now under Pat Verbeek and under full season with Pat Verbeek, I've noticed that the Ducks do have a direction now. If you would think maybe 3-4 years ago, when GM Bob Murray was still around. And this is really a testament to the latter stages of GM Bob Murray's tenure, and this is kind of a callback to the last episode that I did. GM Bob had a tendency to rush players a little bit and kind of rush their development a little bit, which I think may have led to certain players getting benched. You know who I'm talking about? It may have led to guys that just are not ready yet. And that happened a lot in especially 2021, 22, before Pat Verbeek really took the reins. That was an issue. And now the direction is give them an extra year in juniors. Let them be a black ace later. And we especially saw that the first year of Pat Verbeek's run. And that's the direction that the team is going now. The direction is give them more time in juniors or give them more time in college. That's partially why we have seen the teams that we've seen or the rosters that we've seen deployed the last couple of seasons. It's why we haven't seen the likes of, well, I mean, injury has to do with it too, but maybe that's why Tristan Luneau and Noah Warren might wind up playing for the Goals next season. It's why Olin Zellweger took a bit of time to come through the system. So it's going to be all about how they get developed. And I think this year probably is going to be the most important year for the Ducks development this year. I mean, last year was important too. And you saw what happened with Ducks in the juniors last year. This year is going to be even more important. So I'm very fascinated to see where the Ducks go. And I think Carey Terrance, I think, is going to be the biggest case of a fast riser in the Ducks organization. And this has to do with the organizational depth in the long run, which I do want to talk about after the second intermission. So what I'm going to do now, since I'm kind of heading toward that direction, is we're going to take the second intermission right now. And I do want to talk about the organizational depth in the long run. We will get to that on the other side. Welcome back to Locked On Anaheim Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Once again, you're locked in with Jason JD Hernandez. Let's talk about this depth. I don't think it's a depth issue. It's a good problem to have when you have plenty of centers that are getting better and better and better and whose stock is rising. And I am talking about Carey Terrance among those players. But look who the Ducks have in front of them. They got a ton of guys up the middle that he has to contend with. You've got Trevor Zegras. You've got Frank Vetrano. You got Isaac Lundestrom. You got Leo Carlson, Mason McTavish. And I would say the centers that you really got to worry about if you're someone like Carey Terrance is Trevor Zegras, who the Ducks are playing more at center these days. Leo Carlson, who I honestly think could be a top tier center, easily a top 6 center in the future for the Ducks. Mason McTavish, also top 6 center capability. So you got to compete with that. And Isaac Lundestrom, who was your steady third line, fourth line center. Then you have Robbie Fabry, who plays center. Ryan Strome, who plays some center. Alex Killorn, who plays some center. Frank Vetrano, who plays some center. Now, some of those guys could play center / wing, so they could move around. But that is a lot of depth up the middle for the Anaheim Ducks. But this is a good problem to have. And then you look at guys in the San Diego Gulls system that are centers. And they've got some guys there too. Ryan Carpenter, he's the veteran, so that maybe doesn't count. But you already have Nathan Gaucher. You have Jan Mysak. So where does Carey Terrance fit into that? I mean, Josh Lapina is also a center, so maybe that's where he fits in, is he takes over one of those spots from Josh Lapina or Jan Mysak. So the developmental depth is good for the Ducks. And then you add in someone else that the Ducks just drafted this season, who is a supremely good goal scorer up the middle, a bit undersized. Well, okay. Undersized by Pat Verbeek standards. That's what I really should have said at first. Undersized by Verbeek standards is Lucas Pettersson. Lucas Pettersson is expected to get some solid time overseas this season and just has a great ceiling in his game. So that's another center that the Ducks maybe want to bring up a little bit carefully and see where he fits into this. But this is a good problem to have. This is a good problem to have because it promotes competition, especially when you look at that last center spot for the Ducks. That's going to be a very heated competition coming in the next 2-3 years. It's also important to note that all those guys in the Duck system that I just mentioned, they might not be around after this season. Frank Vetrano, he's going to be massive trade bait this coming season during the trade deadline, or the Ducks could let him go. But if the Ducks have another poor season, which they could, Frank Vetrano could likely be this year's candidate to be traded during the trade deadline. Same with Robbie Fabry. He could be the next guy that gets traded during the whole, I guess, mess of the trade deadline this coming March, I believe is when it's going to be. So once you start losing those guys, next man up. That is the good thing about having the organizational depth and the good young depth that the Ducks have, especially in that position. So do I think the Ducks are primed to really go forward this season? They could take a couple steps forward this season. Are they playoff bound this season? Probably not, especially in a weaker Pacific Division. So, I mean, it's possible. But the Ducks are still maybe another year away. Not this year, but maybe another year after that from making the playoffs. So then you look to the San Diego Gulls. What is the ceiling in that position for the San Diego Gulls as well? Could this player be a tweener down the line? I believe that guys like Carey Terrance has a good ceiling. Same with Lucas Pettersson. They have good ceilings for the Ducks in the future. Wings, they should look at for the future. Defense, they've got plenty of it. And this also is a part of their organizational depth that the Ducks have right now. I mean, look at the defenseman depth that the Ducks have right now. The young defensive depth. Jackson Lacombe, Pavel Mintyukov, Olin Zellweger, Tristan Luneau, Noah Warren. Those 6 guys alone. Oh, and Drew Hellison. How do we forget about Drew Hellison? Oh my gosh. That's pretty big as well. You add Stian Solberg to that mix, and you could say, you know what? There's a lot of depth there as well. So it's going to be important to have the development go as well and as smoothly as possible. So that's why I have hope for the Ducks in the future, but that's why I have always said, especially the last couple of years, just have patience. Please have patience with the Ducks organization. I think Pat Verbeek does have a plan. And for the most part, we're starting to see what the plan is going to be. And it is going to be internally developing and having that young depth. I think it'll be good in the long run for the Ducks. So that's where I am with this. All right, that's going to do it for this podcast. Once again, thank you all for sticking around and thanks for listening. Hopefully you got a little bit out of that. And we'll have some more talk from the World Junior Showcase. Actually, I'm going to say next week because the showcase goes into this coming weekend. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. In the meantime, thank you so much for listening. Thanks for watching. Don't forget this podcast is free and available across all platforms, including Stitcher, Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, among others. Also, we're ad-free on Amazon, so check us out there, and also hit the subscribe button on the YouTubes. You can follow me on the Twitter sphere or the X sphere. That doesn't sound right. At StimpyJD. The show's Twitter/X is at @LO_Ducks. You could also email me at lockedonanaheimducks@gmail.com. And I am getting a couple messages, messages for the mailbox. So keep sending your questions. And once the mailbag gets filled up, I'll be sure to do a mailbag episode at some point next month. So once again, thank you all for your continued support. It is so greatly appreciated. For Locked On Anaheim Ducks, I'm Jason JD Hernandez saying have a great rest of the day or night. Please remember to be safe out there, be kind to one another, and Ducks fly together.